Okay.
Go ahead.
This is Live from the Table, the official podcast of the world-famous Comedy Cellar, a podcast focusing on Yiddishkeit, Israel, and the Jewish world.
Come on, don't. People are going to turn it off. Don't say that. Rephrase.
This is Live from the Table, the official podcast of the world-famous Comedy Cellar, and we are available wherever you get your podcasts, available on YouTube, available on demand on Sirius XM satellite radio. This is Dan Natterman, here with Noam Dworman, the owner of the world-famous Comedy Cellar, the ever-expanding world-famous Comedy Cellar, a new location coming hopefully this year or early 26 on the corner of West 3rd and 6th Avenue. We have Periel Ashenbrand here with us as well, writer, comedian, wife, mother, writer. Did I say that already? And our guest today, Yair Rosenberg, an American journalist and staff writer at The Atlantic, where he covers politics, culture, and religion, and writes the Deep Shtetl newsletter. Formerly a senior writer at Tablet Magazine, a regular speaker and commentator on anti-Semitism in the modern era. Welcome, Yair, to our program.
It's good to be here.
Yeah, I'm very happy to meet you. So before we went, started recording, turns out you and Periel know each other from previous lives.
Yeah, before I was at The Atlantic, I was at Tablet Magazine some years ago, and I used to guest edit their blog on the summer when the editor would take a much deserving vacation, and she wrote a column, and it was a very, very easy edit, and so it's an easy part of my job.
Now I've heard, and also I've heard firsthand, and I've also heard people discuss on shows that a lot of writers that we read all the time hand in terrible copy. Have you had this experience?
So not in this case, right? Which was really helpful. I think she wrote on Fridays or something. It was like a Friday column. And it's really helpful on Friday to just know this is coming in. I don't have to think much about it and it will look good. But there are apps. I mean, I think the most famous example was Stephen Glass, right? The fabulist at the New Republic. Who people thought, well, how did he fool so many people for so long? And one of the theories was he was just such a good, vivid writer that people were drawn into it and they were fooled. And then after it all came out, his coworkers were like, no, he was a terrible writer. He had all these like great anecdotes and things that he'd come up with that he claimed were true, but he couldn't write at all. And they would clean it up and make it sound the way you saw. So that theory like fell out the window. But it's a great example of how it's a collaborative effort in journalism. And you see my name on an article. Like today I wrote the Atlantic's daily newsletter. But there were like 5 people who edited that thing before you even get to the copy editors. And they make everything sound better. Even if you gave good copy, it'll end up, with that 5% better when the team is doing what it's supposed to do.
Now, have you started to use like ChatGPT or Claude? I've spoken to some prominent journalists who already...
What's Claude, you said?
Claude's another AI, but it's apparently very good at writing. And I use it. It's a helpful... Not that I would publish something that it wrote for me, but I'll say... What do you think of this? How could you improve this? And usually there's something that it changes the word order or a better adjective or something like that.
I use it more as like a better Google search if I'm trying to find something that I know. For example, I know there's a quote about how stupid the vice presidency is for a piece that I was writing about J.D. Vance and how people hate being vice president.
But it hallucinates quotes.
Exactly. So you can't trust anything.
Verify it.
You can't trust anything it says. So one, it helps to ask something that you know is real, right? But you can't quite pin it down. And then it will tell you, and then you say, what's your source for that? And then you go and check if it's real.
Yeah.
Right? So there's a lot of steps. The other
Grok is less hallucinatory.
Grok is less hallucinatory. That's what I found. Although it does. In this example, it totally did. Right? And like I'll use it to say or I have 3 examples in mind for something I want to argue in my piece. And I want to make sure I didn't miss any good other examples, juicy other examples that back it up. So I'll say, here are 3 things that are examples of X. Do you have any, can you think of any others that fit this set? And then again, it will often give you 1 that's real and 3 that are fake, right? So you have to actually use your wits. But it can be useful in that way. The other thing I do is sometimes I'm working on an idea for a column. I know what I want it to say. I even basically know all the points. And I'll basically feed a bunch of that, including some really helpful pointers for what I'm going to say to the AI and say, write this in the voice of Yair Rosenberg just to see how soon I will be replaced. And I have yet to get a column anywhere close to the one that I'm going to do. That's not me to say that it won't get there, but it hasn't happened yet.
Dude, ask it to write you, and ask Claude is very good. Ask it to write you anything in the style of Christopher Hitchens. It is fucking remarkable.
Yeah.
The insight, the actual insight that these LLMs seem to show, I would not have thought it was possible.
I listened to a Yankees baseball podcast. Everyone's imperfect. My imperfection is I'm a Yankee fan. And so there's a wonderful Yankee podcast called Talking Yanks, and every, episode they recap the last Yankee series, and the guy does some, like plays on words and cultural references and just like quickly goes through the game in a funny way. And the guy was out. So they fed it, said, do it in this guy's voice, do the recap, and then do it in each of the other hosts' voice if they were the ones who did it, because no, they wouldn't, because they're not capable. And it would show them these tics that they had that were genuine, and they didn't realize they had them until, because of it had eaten all that stuff. I think the reason why I find the AI can't do what I'm doing yet is that there's like elements of voice that maybe it can get from reading enough of you, but what it can't do is like actually unspool a really good argument. Yet, like if you're writing really high level arguments, unfortunately, a lot of arguments that we make, on social media and elsewhere, they're not very. But if you're really doing a good job, it can't do that yet.
In recent times, I'm beginning to differ on that point. I don't want to disclose the details, but I fed it some stuff. I did two things. There was a really softball interview of I can't say it. Anyway, there's a real softball interview of a prominent figure, and by somebody that I can tell you off the mic. And I fed it. I said, read these 3 articles about this figure. Here's a transcript of the interview. Tell me what was good or bad about the interview, what they should have asked. And this fucking AI, it asked exactly the right questions. And then I had a long conversation with somebody who had also written an article. And I said, I fed it a transcript of the conversation. I said, here's our conversation compared to what he wrote, and make arguments. And I was stunned at how insightful. That's all I can say. It's an amazing technology, and it's in its infancy.
Well, something I found that it's good at that I find satisfying is, the constant thing where you have someone writes an article and there's an argument and there's a bunch of links in it, and the links purport to back up what they say. And if you know enough, you sign click the links, or you knew what they're talking about, and they're mischaracterizing links. Yeah. It's the bane of all journalists. When someone links to you and they don't quote you, almost always a tell. And so I fed it a piece that I felt like had really mischaracterized a bunch of things. And I said, check each of these links and tell me if it accurately represents the contents, if yes, why, and if not, not. And I mean, I didn't bias it in one way or the other. I just said, check these for me. And it nailed 9 out of 10.
That's exactly the point.
And it's like, this is a useful tool. If you can get people to do it, right, they could use it to critically evaluate some of the stuff that they're being fed. It's constantly improving. And as I said, that's why I check, because I am curious, when will it get to the point? I do think that when it gets to the point that it can do some of the things that I do, what it actually ends up doing is becoming a collaborator for many writers, where they can say, okay, here's a bunch of the things that I'm thinking about and the ideas, and as you say, help me make it better. What are some of the counter arguments, right? Or I'm trying to find the right phrase in my voice to do this sort of thing, and it will enable people to be more productive without necessarily, exploiting interns, right? As some, people have done to get much more work out there. And so it can, I've seen AIs that do music. It's a similar thing. It's not going to necessarily on the first 10 tries give you a great song, but if you say compose a riff, it can help you elaborate that, come up with harmonies, expand, try out different instrumentation styles. I do music, so this is a hobby. I do too. And so it can be really valuable as a collaborator in a way it can't be as an originator yet.
Yeah, but it's pretty friggin' amazing. Anyway, where are you, before we get into other stuff, where are you on the Rogan-Murray-Smith debate?
So I've only watched clips because life is short, and I was on vacation for Passover, and even then I wrote an article. And so I really couldn't tell you a really informed opinion on it.
Or on the
I
subject.
Do get the sense from the things that I've seen that, given my opinions on these issues, that they were kind of set up and they were more polar extremes on this issue. And that's the kind of debate that people like on podcasts. People before that, it's not exclusive to podcasts. I've seen it happen on public radio and many other places. They want sharp contrast and that sort of thing. The people who try to introduce nuance and say that there's blame and harms in different directions, and that this is not this it's complicated, let's throw up our hands, but rather let's work through it in a difficult way, right? That sort of thing is much less likely to make its way into these things. And you can have two people with those sorts of viewpoints who very strongly disagree, but they'd have a much more interesting conversation. So I didn't get drawn in by any of those clips because I looked at it and I said I could write everyone's next lines, so to speak, because you know exactly what they're going to say.
Where are you on the general issue of the explosion of anti-Semitism on the far right, not just anti-Semitism, the conspiracy theories in general, and the welcoming reception they're getting on the biggest shows in the country?
So the problem with being an anti-Semitism reporter is you get to say, I told you so a lot, and it doesn't really mean anything. So you may have seen, I wrote a piece in months before the election.
Like being a wife.
months before the election, I wrote a piece called "The Anti-Semitic Revolution on the Rising American Right," and it was a long piece that I've been working on for over a year. I started long before October 7th. This wasn't something that October 7th created, and I've been talking on and off the record to a lot of people on the right, in the pro-Trump right. People who are seeing things that they did not like, and seeing, particularly on the young right and new media right and all these sorts of things, the rise of ways of thinking and talking about Jews that they had thought were sort of bygones, that were just not part of their coalition. And now they were coming back, with a vengeance, first behind closed doors and then much more publicly.
Specifically?
And so I wrote in the piece, you had people saying to me, like, people whose names you'd recognize saying, it's not that Trump is Hitler, and that's a ridiculous comparison, but it's that Trump opens the door through the style of politics he does, where he never has any enemies on his own side who praise him. He'll never criticize his own camp, right? He lets in a tremendous number of people who he doesn't police, some of whom, right, bring an anti-Semitic way of thinking about Jews, and they gain more and more power because they move closer and closer to the center of power in a way they could never before Trump. And so then a generation from that, you have Karl Lueger, right, the mayor of Vienna, who served as an inspiration for Hitler. And then after that, you have, and this was before October 7th, and I would argue social media and October 7th, which put the locus of focus on Jews, right, and Jewish power and the state of Israel, and made them the constant topic of conversation, supercharged this, and social media, as it usually does, accelerated this phenomenon. And we've jumped through a lot of those hoops a lot faster than these people were warning me in, late 2022, right, had expected. And again, these was people on the right telling me this. This was not me talking to, and not to say that left-wing critics weren't trenchant in seeing some of this stuff. It's always easier to see it on the other side in a way. But people inside the right knew that this was going on, and they are fighting now more openly because October 7th, much as it created this split on the left and caused people to fight amongst themselves over anti-Semitism, Jews, and Israel, it did the same thing on the right. It's just that people have less of a visibility and window into it. But it became really obvious. You see, Chris Rufo taking a stance over here, like fighting with these people. The Babylon Bee and their people are fighting with Tucker Carlson, and they're fighting with Candace Owens, right? This has come out into the open. And if you know where to look, you see it constantly. And it's only going to get more pitched, I think, as time goes on.
Yeah, my take on you, with all due respect, I shouldn't even say with all due respect, because that sounds make it worse than it is. I agree with you on a lot of stuff. I always have. But you lose me, or I lose you, when it somehow trying to interpret it in the partisan way. I don't see Trump that way. I see the right that way. And I give you something that I always think about in terms of the elusiveness of determining causation. Trump was very keen on the vaccine for a long time. And but if Trump and even the accusation that he took the vaccine secretly at the time, actually that was because the papers were coiled to criticize him for jumping the line. So he kind of took it on the DL. But there were a number of times when he would, go out there and talk about the vaccine. He was Operation Warp Speed. Anyway, but if Trump had been anti-vax, and I tried to convince you, and of course the right turned completely anti-vax, right? And I tried to convince you, no, they're not anti-vax because of Trump. They would have been anti-vax anyway. You'd say, no, what are you talking about? Are you telling me that it's just a coincidence that President Trump is anti-vax and all his crazy followers are anti-vax? I would never be able to make that case. But the fact is that he wasn't anti-vax. He was pro-vax. He was so proud of the vaccine, and he could not corral his followers.
Yeah.
And whatever it is that makes them anti-vax, that is a very good indicator of people who are going to fall for anti-Semitic ideas as well. And I think there's something about that right-wing.
Let's talk about those things. So I don't think we're actually disagreeing.
Yeah.
There's a whole bunch of factors that make people more susceptible to anti-Semitism. They're not necessarily political, although they might be found in particular parts of the right now. But you find them everywhere. They're pre-political. So just to take an obvious example, populist politics maps very easily onto anti-Semitism,
yes,
which doesn't make populist politics illegitimate. In fact, today, populist politics have rose basically starting in 2016 on the left in the form of the Bernie Sanders campaign, on the right in the form of Donald Trump, based on trenchant critiques of the failures of American elites, economic, foreign policy, right later on public health, on all of these metrics. And now we're looking at critiques of academia that are being used to justify tremendous assaults on academia, but that doesn't mean that there aren't reasonable critiques of how the academy has conducted itself, not just on October 7th, but well before.
Right.
And so you have all these failures of the elites, and then you have these movements that emerge on the left and on the right with varying degrees of justification, saying that the elites failed you, they messed you over, they didn't do the things they said they were going to do, and they betrayed the masses, and now we should rise up against it. That is, again, a well-attested form of politics, and America for a while didn't have that, and certainly not in the European sense. And then we now did have it. The problem with that kind of politics is that once you say that there's this shadowy cabal of elites who are screwing over the masses, is that it's a hop, skip, and a jump away from centuries of propaganda that says it's the Jews.
Well, let's be honest. If there is a shadowy cabal of elites, it will be the Jews.
I mean, I don't know, right? Like, I really find because this is the thing, right? Like, it's fun to me. I used to do all these kinds of jokes too, but like Jews, have you ever like in a room like us and then expand the room and add more and more Jews?
Can't agree on anything.
They can't agree on anything. They couldn't conspire their way out of a paper bag. I was just at a Passover program, trust me, full of Jews, right? That's just not how it works.
Was there a comic performing, by the way?
Was there a comic performing? Elon Gold.
I was going to see the Modi or Elon Gold.
I saw Modi another year. Like, there's a certain group of people who do the circuit, and you can imagine
Avi Lieberman if your budget's a little bit lower.
But so populist politics, which it's not in and of itself anti-Semitic, is easily corrupted in that way. Much like, people would say, the famous line is socialism, like anti-Semitism is the socialism of fools. Mm-hmm. Anti-Semitism is the failure mode of populism, right? We have more populism, we get more anti-Semitism. It's a natural thing, right? We also changed how we communicate with each other. We use this thing called social media, instantaneous, globalized conversation that has all sorts of bad incentives for how we think about the world and talk about it. And like, again,
what about inevitability?
Yeah.
Just return to the historical mean of anti-Semitism. The Holocaust is fading away as a memory.
So let me tell you,
it was destined to happen.
So let me tell you how I think about it, because I agree, but I think most people think of the Holocaust fading as all of these Holocaust survivors are dying out, right? The Jews who are there to tell the story.
That's not what I mean, but
are gone. Exactly. No, I think a lot of people. I'm not saying necessarily you, but we hear this all the time. The last survivor is going to pass on. I just saw another headline about this, which is, of course, a tragedy and something that the Jewish community is losing. But it is not the reason why the memory fading is a non-Jewish phenomenon. And it's specifically about, if you look at the history of American attitudes towards Jews, they were not nearly as warm before the Holocaust. Ken Burns did a whole documentary which is largely about this sort of thing, this forgotten history of American anti-Semitism. But of course, that's why Roosevelt was reticent to enter the war. Roosevelt was reticent to do things to help the Jews of Europe because he could read a poll. Right? They didn't want the Jewish refugees in here. When they asked them about them, you'd see things like, do you think they're German spies? And many people would say yes. The poll that I think is the most telling is after the Nuremberg laws, I think it was Gallup, polled the Americans and said, do you think the persecution or whatever is happening to the Jews is, all their fault, somewhat their fault, not much their fault, or not at all their fault? That sort of classic question. Majority of people said either some or all their fault. Blamed Jews for their own persecution. So
persecution in America or
in Europe? What was happening to them in Europe, right? So this is what this general sense of it was in the United States. Then America ends up joining the war, Pearl Harbor, many other things, and Americans go abroad, and we have tons of people who fight there, and they see the Nazis and what they did firsthand. They see the camps, they liberate the camps. Eisenhower has it filmed. All these people come back and tell the story. It becomes part of the American identity, the American story, that we're against the Nazis, we save the Jews, we're against anti-Semitism. That is what it means to be a good American.
And also evangelical Christians also adopted the Jews as a pet.
But that becomes a separate thing with the rise of the, religious right.
But after the war...
Wait,
so just to finish, very relevant to what he just said.
Just to finish like one more sentence. And so it's really not about Holocaust survivors. It's about the American experience and all those people who had that experience and shared it, and that changed their sense of American identity. And all of them are passing away. And so now, as you say, we're reverting. And we have all these polls now. We're starting to have real data that shows you have an age curve on anti-Semitism. You ask people, do you have an unfavorable opinion of Jews? David Shor asked this, right, the top Dem pollster, and he found whether you're a Harris supporter or Trump supporter, slight differences, but basically he found an age curve. If you're younger, like 25%, 20 to 25% will say openly, I have an unfavorable opinion of Jews, and it just collapses as you get older and older, which makes sense, again, because of this experience.
What do you want to say, Dan?
Yeah.
Well, after the war, did Americans when Americans looked back at what they had accomplished by defeating Hitler, did they see it primarily as a victory over fascism, or as saving the Jews? I would imagine, saving the Jews was not prominent in how they.
It wasn't when they first went, right? It actually becomes bigger later. Exactly, it becomes part of the story again because they liberate the death camps. They see these Jews who are emaciated. It leaves a deep, deep impression, right? And that becomes part of the American story. It's certainly not why they went. right? They went because of Pearl Harbor. They went because they were sort of like, pushed into it. That it was never, and that's going to be true for any national interest country. They're very rarely, it's an unusual thing that we have an expectation, I think, that countries will go to war for minority populations that are being beleaguered or hurt or harmed in other places, right? That's very unusual. It's actually quite something that we told the story for, like, there's this constant critique of Roosevelt that he didn't bomb the railway tracks to Auschwitz, right? That he didn't do more to save the Jews. I think that says something beautiful about America, that there's this expectation that America should have done that.
Yeah, but who's making that argument? The Jews. I don't know.
No,
exactly.
no,
well, I think there's not just Jews, right, who have made it. And Ken Burns made this documentary about, like, this part of the past. And again, it's kind of very, I think it's almost so incredibly idealistic, right? America's never really necessarily been like that. Most countries, and no country's really ever been like that. But the idea that you can even ask the question, like, for a time, was really something. I think we're moving away from that moment, though.
You don't think that looking back, 20 years from now, that October 7th will have had that effect as well?
Go explain the question further.
That once we see what really happened on October 7th to all of the people at the Nova Festival and to all the children. I mean, if this film just came out, I'm sure you're well aware, the children of October 7th, that opinions about Jews will be similarly sympathetic.
I don't think so. I also just think that that's something that happened somewhere else, and Americans weren't witness to it.
Yeah, but so is the Holocaust, something that happened.
And they did, and there was very little. That's not why they intervened. It's only because they eventually intervened for other reasons, and then experienced what the Holocaust did to Jews. But things happen like October 7th, sadly, in different ways to all over the world all the time. And it doesn't change how people fundamentally see the world.
I've been telling Periel almost since October 8th of 2023 that all our focus on the atrocities gets us nowhere. Nobody, I used to call it atrocity porn. Nobody is going to take Israel's side because we say, look what they did to us. They're going to take Israel's side they're not going to take Israel's side, but they would only take Israel's side if we had used the last year and a half to explain why we're in the right on the conflict itself. And we failed miserably to do that. We said, look, they raped. How could you support the Palestinian people after they raped it? And people will say, yeah, they shouldn't have raped you, but I think Israel's the oppressor in Palestine. So why that doesn't stop because they raped you. And this kind of failure that I mean, just like you were speaking before October 7th, I was speaking before October 7th, that we are failing to even educate our own children as to the important bullet points, and there's not many of them, of the Arab-Israeli conflict, to equip them with the ability to defend Israel morally and intellectually should the shit ever hit the fan. And that's exactly the phrase I use, should the shit hit the fan. And now the shit has hit the fan, and we're impotent. I mean, you ask the average, you wear kippah, so your circles are more informed, but you ask the average secular Jew, they don't even know how the West Bank came into Israel's possession. They don't know Israel was attacked. They don't know nothing. They don't know nothing. And if we don't know it, the non-Jewish world is not going to know
Tiana knows it.
Tiana knows it now from sitting here.
She's been sitting here.
But let me say, the other thing that worried me, and this is what always worried me about the partisan aspect of it, is that the left, and of course I was always I'm sure you were too, concerned about anti-Semitism on the left. The left became anti-Semitic ideologically and maybe even, I hate to say it, racially. Dennis Ross actually was the first person I read saying this, that people from non-European countries are already not disposed to be particularly pro-Jewish or pro-Israel to begin with. And then the intersectionality and all that. And I always felt, and I used to say, that the Jews are so comfortable among the Democrats, while the Republicans are the bulwark of Israel's sentiment in the country. And I used to say that, God forbid, the level of Israel's support in the Republican Party should ever fall to the level of Israel's support in the Democratic Party. You're going to see a total free fall of Israel's support in the United States of America. And that's what I'm worried about now, that we might see that now. Because as you say, it's really about age. It used to be on the Republican side. On the Democrat side, it's all age. On the Republican side, it used to be ideology. Republican ideology used to favor freedom, the West. It used to be, kind of anti-Islam. which benefited support for Israel. But all those old ideological principles are fading away in the new Tucker Carlson, J.D. Vance era of the right. I don't think it's Trump. I think Trump is on our side on all these issues. And it scares the shit out of me. And I don't know if there's anything we can do about it. Although I thought this Joe Rogan thing at least somebody shouting alarm saying, listen, you're normalizing Candace Owens out there talking about Christian babies disappearing on Passover. And Tucker Carlson is saying she's fantastic. And Tucker Carlson sits one seat away from the president at the RNC. And we know he has J.D. Vance's ear. And President Trump is only 78 years old, and he could die tomorrow. And then you have President Vance and Tucker Carlson right by his side. Where does that leave us? It's a scary picture, right?
I mean, I also would just.
I know I'm rambling, but it's
no.
You're all related.
You're telling a very coherent story about sort of the trends in American support for Jews and for Israel, which have shifted. Right, we talked about anti-Semitism being generational, right, and then anti-Israel sentiment tends to be much more so, at least what people will tell pollsters, than whatever you see as anti-Jewish. So you have 25% of people saying they're anti-Semitic and happy to say that out loud, which is a real tell because there's always the people who won't say that, right? There's always going to be more people, right, sometimes with justification, who will say I'm anti-Israel, which is a different kind of conversation. But it will also include all of the anti-Semites. And then suddenly you get to a critical mass, and then you have political leaders who have to ask themselves questions, will I accept the support of anti-Semites if it's useful to me politically? Because I am critical of Israel, and I know that some of these people, I'm Jeremy Corbyn, right? And I know either I'm a real fool or I know that a bunch of these people are actually quite anti-Semitic and they got here for the wrong reasons. They came to our party for criticizing Israel because they really don't like Jews, and this seemed like a good place to do it. Now you can decide you're going to card them at the door and not let them in, right? Or you can decide, well, it's democracy and we need everyone we can get, and we're not going to ask too many questions. And this happens, unfortunately, all the time in politics, not just to Jews, but to other minorities and to other groups. Yes. But the thing is that Jews aren't a lot of us, and they aren't going to be able to decide those things. Those are choices that non-Jews get to make, right? And they make it about themselves and what kind of societies and countries they want to be. That's sort of the answer I have for you, which is not a pro or a con, right? In terms of like how America's going to go the way Americans want it to go. And what kind of America they want to see. The thing about America is that it changes its mind a lot, right? And there's a lot, and like everything that seems to move so fast, like today, history moves on fast forward, a large part thanks to social media, but various other reasons, right? It seems like whatever's the big, giant cause of the day, like we move on from that. Trump almost gets assassinated, we move on from that pretty quick, right? All of those things. So that can be really disorienting, but it also can be comforting because it means that we move through these epochs much faster. And it's possible there can be less damage and more enlightenment than we might get. So that would be my optimistic spin on it.
Do you take anything pessimistic?
And then I say internationally, Israel has agency. The great success of the Zionist project was to give Jews actual agency with a country, with a government, with an army, right, with politicians, and they can make decisions in history in a way that the Jews never could as minorities subject to majority populations. I would argue that Israel's leaders have made many, many terrible decisions for quite some time, and I've written about these at length. But that doesn't have to be the case, right? And there's always the possibility of renewal, and there's always, because they have that.
Israel's made terrible decisions?
Israel's leadership, right? Netanyahu being the leader of Israel.
What difference could any decision have made?
What difference could any decision have made?
I'm always open to this.
I don't think, like magic thing, that there's like, some sort of nonsense that if Israel just comported itself in the perfect possible way, that the anti-Semitism would fall away. This is nonsense.
Or that Hamas would make peace with Israel.
Yeah. No. This sort of stuff is nonsense. There are always certain people who just want all Jews to be gone and to go away, and the same true of Israel. But the way you conduct your own country matters, the whether you're going to have resilience to all of these sorts of threats and the way you're going to deal with them in healthy or unhealthy ways. And Israel is domestically misgoverned horrifically, right? Let's talk about a piece I wrote, right? Where I said that Netanyahu has become the prime minister for the 30%, right? This is totally corrosive to democracy on every issue that Israelis that the future of their country depends on, right? Whether you're conscripting ultra-Orthodox Jews who don't serve in the army but are the fastest growing demographic. Everyone wants that. The majority of Netanyahu's own voters want that, but he has no coalition and he doesn't stay in power if he does that, right? Because he needs the ultra-Orthodox parties. And so he does anyway. Even Bezalel Smotrich kind of wants it, right? And he's sort of not able to say it because he has to be in this coalition. But even like everybody wants that, can't do it, right? 70-30 issue, they would be willing to end the war with Hamas, even though they would like to eradicate Hamas to get the rest of the hostages back. Right? That is just a fact. That has been a consistent finding of all the polling. Netanyahu decides no. Now, there are reasonable arguments.
I don't agree.
There are reasonable arguments.
I don't agree with you about the analysis of the polls.
So we'll continue, but I'm saying one thing if it's one poll, right? But it Harry Enton would tell you these polls tell you directionality.
Downstairs.
Is he downstairs?
Yeah.
I'll have to say hi. He will tell you. I've talked to him about these sorts of things because you have to know how much you can do. But when it consistently shows up, so ultra orthodox enlistment, hostage deal, right? That's a charged one. But then we talk about the Supreme Court overhaul, which again is something that had justification. Israel said, I've written about this. Israel is one of the most superpowered Supreme Courts on the planet. It was a left-right consensus that it needed to be reformed, taken down a peg. But Netanyahu sort of outsourced it to the most right-wing people in his coalition, and then they sort of said, why don't we destroy the court? And then that became a 70-30 issue against it.
Yeah, let me
all of these
let me
things.
tell why I don't really agree with you. Although I don't, except for the wanting the war to end, which I don't think Israel wants the war to end if it means that Hamas could reconstitute. And
that is what the polls say.
Yeah, sometimes the polls are, as we know, can be wrong.
But do you believe that they gave back 1,000 people for just Gilad Shalit, and one of them was Yaakov Sinwar? Like, this is Israel's ethos, whether you like it or not. It is actually the preference. And Netanyahu did that because he also could read polls.
Yeah, but in general, any particular snapshot of any country at any time has some of the things that you're describing. We have our own 70-30. I mean,
you can have always one or two. The problem is on every major issue, Haredi enlistment, the hostage deal, and how to deal with the war, right? The Supreme Court. There's one more that I could give you. What's the other one? I'm trying to remember this from the piece. But like I'm trying to remember the last one. It will come back to me. But basically, if you go through every single one of the key issues on Israel's, basic fundamental domestic and international politics, Israelis disagree with Netanyahu, but his coalition demands that he take those sides. Yeah. And he's allowed. He's allowed.
Hold on.
Yeah.
So like we had our 70-30 issues. I mean, what's his name? Roy Teixeira wrote a whole 10 different 70-30 issues that our parties.
The Democrats lost in large part because they took the wrong side of 70-30 issues.
The border issue. But I'm saying, my point is that there's I think there are always, we don't have a coalition system, but we have 49-51 majority in the Senate where one, Joe Manchin becomes a coalition, and it's easy. I think there's always times when this stuff happens, and it's easy just to ignore all the good things. The fact is that Israel was thriving. Its tech sector is the envy of the world. The standard of living was higher than ever. Everybody told Netanyahu he was crazy to try to pursue separate peace with the Arab countries. John Kerry, arrogant, no, it'll never happen. He was right about that. Hezbollah is destroyed. Iran is prone. I mean, the outcome of this war has put Israel in a remarkable situation. And so the counterfactuals are just not known. Yes, I agree with you on especially about the far right drafting, and I agree with you. I went about the judicial reform. I don't know the details of it, but I think that they should tread very lightly about breaking that norm because you don't know where it can lead. I also don't have that much fear about Israel becoming a dictatorship for the reason that you said earlier. I just can't imagine Israelis abiding by some guy says, no free speech.
They're more likely to have a civil war than to have a dictator.
But we have in our country derangement syndromes in either direction, Trump derangement syndrome and Biden derangement syndrome. And Israel is the same. And we read their papers, and their papers are no more reliable on their political enemies as our papers are on our political enemies. So I pour cold water on a lot of it. I think it'd be great for Netanyahu to go, but I will predict here that when the next prime minister takes over, you're going to see all kinds of the same problems. You're going to see 70-30 issues. You're going to see the world. Turns out they didn't give a shit. They like to say it's not about the Jews, it's about Netanyahu. They're saying that because they don't want to say it's about Israel. But when if Barack were prime minister, he'd be.
There are some people who are criticizing Israel using Netanyahu's code, and they would just swap in the next one.
All of
right?
Them. Nobody really cares.
But there are a lot of Americans who really because they fundamentally associate Netanyahu with the guy who came to the United States Congress in front of Barack Obama and went against his signature foreign policy thing. This was a formative moment for many people. They associate him as the guy who stood next to Trump, smiling and smirking over and over again. These were choices that
you're right.
Netanyahu made because you can still do diplomacy and be friends with Trump without doing this. But Netanyahu put himself on billboards with Trump in Israel, right, saying that I'm in another league. That was the slogan he ran on for re-election. By the way, those posters are
uninformed.
Biden. Those were Netanyahu with Trump, which hasn't worked out amazingly well in the long run, right? Netanyahu with Putin, which worked out terribly after October 7th, and Netanyahu with Modi, which, okay, for now, still working, right? So those posters, they've curled and not aged so well. But no, so here's the thing. You can give Netanyahu tremendous credit. Also one of the most agile and effective politicians and maneuvers, of our time. I think he's one of the most effective communicators and advocates for his own cause of anyone we've ever seen. So, like, for example, you mentioned how everyone said you couldn't get a separate peace with the Arab countries. You had to do it through the Palestinian issue. And, Bibi said no otherwise, and he gets the Abraham Accords with Trump. But here's the thing.
Tremendous
that only happens because of the Iran deal that he tried to stop, right? So we have all these WikiLeaks cables that show all the Arab countries are terrified of Iran getting nukes. And they go to America and say, cut off the head of the snake. That's the word. We want you to bomb Iran, right? And of course, Obama's not going to do that, right? And so then they make the Iran deal. This freaks them out. Right. And so they're like, okay, we need some sort of bulwark in the region because the Americans are no longer reliable. Well, now suddenly Israel looks a lot more attractive. And plus, they're a better avenue to Washington at getting perhaps our concerns heard. Right. And so then you get the Abraham Accords, and Bibi takes advantage of this opening. But it only happens because of this thing that he tried to stop. Yes, right. And failed to stop.
But he saw it. But he saw it.
But here's the thing. Do you think they were publishing op-eds in the newspaper saying we'd like to have peace with you, right? It wasn't like it was hidden, right? You think that Yair Lapid wouldn't have noticed it? I would say by the way, that Naftali Bennett, Yair Lapid, there's a wide array of actually extremely talented Israeli politicians who, if not for Netanyahu, would actually do a relatively good job.
Look, I don't know the answer to that. It's a totally valid question. I wonder the same thing about Operation Warp Speed. I'm like, wouldn't any president know to do that? But I asked Tyler Cowen.
No, I don't think so. I think let's just switch completely, right? Because it's a fun, interesting conversation, and it's
no, but it's the same. It's the same kind of argument. Like, it's so obvious. Wouldn't any president have done it? It's so obvious. Wouldn't any prime minister?
If you read Abundance by my colleague Derek Thompson and Ezra Klein, the Democratic. Affinity for government doesn't, extend. It ends up becoming an affinity for process over results. And so you would have had so many of these things in the way of getting Operation Warp Speed done. What Operation Warp Speed did is said, you don't actually have to do that. You can just cut through all the red tape because it's an emergency, and it works.
So that makes the Trump presidency, the first one, worth it?
Well, so does Operation Warp Speed make it worth it? I mean, this is a really insane question that I'd have to do a tremendous amount of math. Like, how many lives? I mean, I think Trump used to say that this was one of his greatest accomplishments, but he no longer does.
No, I'm saying if you could have Trump if you could have had Hillary Clinton president.
But she couldn't have done Operation Warp Speed.
But there'd be no vaccine.
Well, we would have gotten a vaccine. It would have taken longer.
Now.
Right? Of course you would have had it.
The Times predicted 10 or 12 years.
So it's interesting. I can't know. It's one of those, counterfactuals that, the great thing about being a reporter is you report on the president, not the past or the future. So I couldn't tell you. But I do think he deserved credit for it. I also think that there's a question of when that was run by Jared Kushner, why is Jared Kushner not in this administration?
That's a good question.
It often looks to me like politicians often get elected and they misread their mandates and they misunderstand what people liked about what they did. And then they say, well, now I have the mandate to do something completely different. And that's not actually...
I did hear
from Doge is like a parody of Operation Warp Speed because it's just breaking things, but not actually doing something that people want when it breaks them.
Hold on. I heard from someone who knows that Kushner is involved behind the scenes.
Well, I'm sure he talks to people.
No, but that he's actually still influenced.
I don't know, but
kitchen cabinet.
I don't know, but if you look, it just seems, and I wouldn't blame him, right? It was a really insane, tumultuous 4 years, and you have a growing family, and people just don't. But it is very interesting to see. I wrote about this today in the Atlantic's newsletter that a tremendous number of the people who were part of the Biden administration, the Trump first administration, are just not there anymore. They're not there. The whole top line people and the people who work for them, they're not. It's a wholly different group of people, and many of them have different agendas.
It's much worse than we imagined it would be so far, right? The Trump presidency.
It depends who you asked and who was imagining. Because, my publication was, I think, often looked at to an extent as, being a little bit alarmist. We did an issue called If Trump Wins, which people can look up.
Well, your publication, I mean, come on.
And I'm just saying, look up If Trump Wins and start clicking the articles and tell me how well they're holding up, right? And I think people would have looked at that at the time and said, this is alarmist, right? And now you look at it and you're like, okay, which of these is going to fall next?
Okay. That's not just alarmist. After October 7th, Ann Applebaum had a column blaming Trump for October 7th. It is so...
I didn't read, I couldn't say. But seriously,
Now, by the way, I should say, I'm good friends. I love Adrian LaFrance and Yasha, there's Connor Friedersdorf, like you guys have. fantastic, some of my favorite writers ever.
We have a lot of people, and we have a lot of great people. We have a lot of great people who disagree with each other, and that's what I appreciate. And I know that I can write that thing that other people would disagree with, and then I can do that, and that's really
I didn't
important
sound
to me.
like I was bashing Atlantic.
And also, like, I can't. So as I said, I can't, like you say, is it worse than it imagined, right? It really depends who was doing the imagining. Yeah. And in a certain sense, I don't know how much it's valuable to know who got it right, because then maybe you can look and say, that person, Nate Silver would say to you, that person's a good person to look to as a forecaster in the future, because they have something of a track record and they seem to have seen things you didn't.
Of a track record of predicting for 10 years.
But that being said, I don't want to tell people, like let's relitigate who got it right. It's more like saying, okay, this is going on. What do you do about it?
Yeah.
And I think that's the more productive
But is it worse
conversation.
than you imagined it would be?
In some ways, yes. In some ways, no. Because I had a more alarmist notion. Basically, my understanding of the Trump first administration was that he had a tremendous number of people around him who were Republican establishment or business people and other people he brought in, and they actually mitigated a tremendous amount of damage. And left to his own instincts with people who were there because he suborned the entire Republican Party, you're going to get full maximum Trump, and people are not going to like all of that. And I felt bad because I saw people who thought they were voting for some of the things they liked about Trump 1.0.
What do you think his instincts
And I knew
are?
he wasn't going to get it. Like, he thinks the tariffs are awesome in a way that was really reined in by the Gary Cohns and the Steve Mnuchins, and so there are people who knew how to run an economy, and like those people are not there anymore. But because Trump felt that these people actually stopped me from doing this thing that I think is really important, and this is how I understand the world to work.
So a year from now,
and he doesn't have to run for re-election. This is something that distinguishes him from Netanyahu. He really doesn't have to worry about that stuff.
A year from now, you think we're going to have tariffs or we won't have tariffs?
I think we will have tariffs. The question is what level they'll be.
Significantly
Every
higher
day
than
it
Biden
changes.
had. I mean, we had him under Biden.
I think I don't know. I can't say years time spent. I think Trump intends to put higher than what Biden had. Every day it changes. The news that comes out, like, will they be the ones that he's saying? Are they going to be half as much, which would still be extraordinary? I don't know.
I think
will he be on certain industries or not? Exactly. So I don't think that, to be clear, I think Trump is sensitive to public opinion. He's sensitive to markets, and that will do some mitigation. But like this is not my area, because I do not report on the economy, so I'm just channeling other people I've talked to who I consider smart. But I do think that there was, to bring us back to the original question, because Trump wasn't surrounded by some of the people who tempered his worst instincts, and he didn't see it that way, of course, he's having a less successful presidency. He's sort of frittered away a tremendous amount of political capital, a tremendous amount of opportunity to sort of cement a certain realignment politically for the Republican Party, a whole bunch of things that I think if J.D. Vance had his druthers, he would be doing. Yeah. But he can't. And so, whether I agree with J.D. Vance or not, I think that he has a coherent theory of the case. Whereas I think Trump sort of acts on instinct. And some of those, and if you like those instincts, people vote for that, right? If you don't like them, well, you're stuck with them.
I hate J.D. Vance.
I don't know enough about him personally to give you a personal opinion.
Well,
but I do feel that, my reporting where I write about sort of the anti-Semitism and conspiracy theories that have percolated on the right, you invariably butt up against people who are friends with him. And then when it comes to him, he never repeats that stuff. He never amplifies it.
He said Alex Jones is right about a lot of stuff.
But what he does is he refuses to repudiate it. So
he big upped Alex Jones.
When Tucker Carlson had, this is something you were engaged in, right? Tucker Carlson had Daryl Cooper on his show, and that we have this whole conversation about Holocaust revisionism and so forth. They asked, this was during the campaign, right, late in the campaign, they asked J.D. Vance, Tucker Carlson, you're about to do an event with him next week on stage, right? He was instrumental, they didn't ask him, but he was instrumental in helping you get the vice presidency nod. Do you have any criticism of his doing this? And his response was, the difference between us and them, right, is that in the Republican Party, we're the party of free speech. Questionable considering some of the other things they're doing now. But he said that we're the party of free speech, and that means we don't have to agree with each other on all the things, right? But we don't censor and shut those things down. Which is an extremely convenient way of not actually answering the question, which is simply to say, because here's the thing, if you have free speech, you have the free speech to say, and I thought that was atrocious, right? And I thought it was wrong, right? And he didn't say that, which shows that you're not actually defending the principle of free speech. You're actually defending the thing that was said or trying not to condemn it.
Absolutely.
And by the way, we see this, of course, in certain senses, on the other side of this, when, various pro-Palestinian activists are detained by this government and taken to, this or that detention facility. And I'm against those things. But, it doesn't stop me from saying, when they did engage in misconduct, when they did support terrible causes and their organizations celebrated the murder of Jews, right? You should be able to say all those things and say, and still in a free country, in a free speech society, we don't lock people up for that, right? And so, but the people who are only willing to say we shouldn't lock them up, but won't criticize what they say, they claim they're making a free speech argument, but they're showing they don't really think that speech is worth protecting unless they agree with it.
Absolutely, you're right. The one thing I'll say about the Trump administration, I'll ask you a question about another article you wrote. I am worried that he might actually defy the Supreme Court in a meaningful way. I never had that worry before. I thought that was not a legitimate worry. I still don't think it's likely. But that would be really, really bad. That would be a disaster. The rest of this stuff, although, the idea that even one person is wrongly deported and finds himself, tortured in a foreign prison, it's really not acceptable. It's just fucking not acceptable. It was also not acceptable that we knew that Kamala Harris had done similar things by fighting to keep people in prison. Connor Friedersdorf in The Atlantic wrote an article about this. And at the time, I couldn't understand, why is she getting a pass? We know that she kept an innocent person in prison. We also know that she fought to prevent a guy on death row from being able to take a DNA test. And I couldn't understand how this was, just passable. And Connor Friedersdorf agreed with me. So I put this in the same category of what I just think is unspeakably wrong. And I don't know why they're doing it. Trump could look like $1 million if he said, "Oh God, let's get this guy back over here. We'll give him his proper hearing, and then we'll throw him out." Right? He had nothing to lose by doing that, except having to admit that he made.
I mean, that's a big thing to lose. They don't. This is we were talking about earlier in the conversation. He will never criticize people who support him. He will not admit error. And one of the lessons that he learned from his first administration was, after he fired Michael Flynn like 10 minutes in, is that didn't solve anything. It actually just made me look weak. That's what he thinks.
Yeah.
And so they will not fire Pete Hegseth. They will not fire anyone over this Signal chat, right? Or anybody else, who makes these sorts of high-level mistakes, because especially if they came out in, a publication like mine, because they see that as capitulation and they see it as showing weakness. And you can agree or disagree with that read of it, but that is absolutely the case. And so I actually think when I look at this, I'm like, yeah, this is unfortunately, sadly, really predictable, because once they screw up, you're really in trouble, because if it's the ego of the Trump administration, whether that they're wrong and your rights, right? I mean, I would not bet on that, in a good way.
Well, the way I'm going to ask you about your story, Trump's Jewish cover story, before we go, but the way I've been thinking about things lately is inspired by my 13-year-old studying for her social studies test. I said this maybe a week before last, but I had the insight that in the end, every presidential administration gets reduced to 4 or 5 bullet points in a middle school textbook. And I think it's a helpful way of looking at it, because there's a lot of noise, especially in the world we live in now, with social media and just the 24-hour news cycle. I'm not yet convinced that the bullet points on Trump 2.0 will be bad. I think the bullet points on Trump 1.0 were good, except for January 6th, which will be one of the bullet points, and we haven't had many things as bad as that. But if he redirects on these tariffs, and if the tariffs don't get us into any kind of like foreign, it's totally not foreseeable, but you could imagine that China says, "Fuck this guy, we're taking Taiwan." You can see the tariffs triggering a much more serious event than simply the markets being roiled, and that would be really something. But I think because he wants to be loved, he will readjust. I worry about the collateral damage of his policies, but it has to be said that much of the reason there is almost no activity at the border anymore is because people are reading about what's going on in America and they're saying, "Oh no, this is not a good time to try to get into America." So he's breaking a lot of eggs to make the omelet. We have to acknowledge it. I mean, I feel like he doesn't have to do it quite the way he's doing it, but we also have to acknowledge that it's tremendously effective at the border in a way that enforcement or even the wall might not have been. So I don't know what that bullet point will be in my grandkids' textbook on the border. I don't know. But he's worse than I expected him to be. And but this has always been the problem with Trump. he's worse in the fact that he does things that aren't even in his own self-interest. This is always the thing that gets me about the guy. After he won the nomination in 2016, the next day he's out there talking about how Ted Cruz's father killed Kennedy. Like, what are you doing? You won, He can't help himself. So...
You mentioned your daughter's social studies class.
Yeah.
What the hell is social studies? Is it history? Basically it was history, but they call it social studies.
When I was in elementary school, it was social studies, but it was clearly our history teacher. So I never understood that, and I was a rule follower, so I didn't ask questions about it, which I really should have at the time. She was a great teacher, but I don't know.
Even his Ukraine maneuvers, although some of them are hard to swallow, it's moving in a way that's better than I imagine it would be if Biden were president. We don't trust Trump on it, but if he doesn't sell out Zelensky. The worst case scenario right now is that he's really exposing the Scott Horton, Dave Smith, right-wing people that actually Putin really is the problem here. Because here, Zelensky's capitulated. He said he's ready to sit down. He said he's ready to make a deal. And Putin's saying, fuck you, I'm not making a deal. That's good.
So I'll ask you the question that you said about Israel. Well, no matter what Israel does, a certain group of people are just never going to actually, give it any sort of, fair evaluation.
Yeah.
Do you really think that there's anything that Vladimir Putin could do that some of these people that you just named would actually change their minds?
Not those people, but the people who don't know. I mean, and this is valid. I'm one of them at times. Like the people, I don't know that much about Ukraine.
Yeah.
Maybe they have a point. Maybe Mearsheimer is I'm not going to go full Mearsheimer, but maybe he's right about being realistic about certain way.
Yeah, so I think in this we're agreeing, which is sort of to say that, there are always the diehards, right, who have an ideological thing that can't be shifted.
Yeah.
But whether it's Ukraine or in Israel, actually there's a large number of people for whom the rest of it matters.
Yeah.
And I might not agree on this particular thing, and you might not agree on my evaluation, but it is important that that can be real, and I think it can be depressing to think of everyone as hardened ideologues, and in my experience that isn't the case.
One thing is for sure on Ukraine is that the heady days of thinking that Ukraine might just pull this off, and maybe Putin's got pancreatic cancer, and maybe he's going to get assassinated. Those days are over, and if we want to be realistic because we want the best outcome for Ukraine, I'm not at all convinced that if this goes on another year, that Ukraine won't be fighting for 70% of his country as opposed to the 80% it's got now. And I likened it to an entrepreneur who doesn't close shop until he's maxed out every credit card, taken every personal loan, gone bankrupt. It's tough. It's very difficult to admit that you have to take a defeat or half a loaf, however you want to put it. And if somebody told me that Ukraine had a reasonable chance of winning or extricating, kicking Russia out of the territories it's taken, I'd say, yeah, let's do it. But I don't think anybody feels that way anymore. So then what, Anyway, one more question about Israel. You can guess. I hate questions about Israel. I never talk about it. I know your answer, but I really think I wish points like this would be made more often. If God were to, do you get offended if I say that? If the Lord were to come down and remove every innocent Palestinian in Gaza and lift them up and deposit them in some safe area of Gaza, exposing only the Hamas fighters and the Hamas evil people, which side of the conflict would be thanking God and which side of the conflict would be cursing God? Which is to say, we don't do a good job of making clear to everybody that it would be Hamas that would be cursing God for removing the civilians and making them safe. And Israel would be saying, thank you, God. Now we can just go in there and kill them all and get rid of our enemies that deserve it without having this around our neck. This backwards view that everybody has, that somehow it's Israel that wants the civilians killed, and that Hamas is just an innocent victim of this. It's enraging. But we want to talk about the Nova Festival. This is the problem. I mean, the Nova Festival, I get it.
No. I thought that was actually an excellent question. I'm surprised I haven't heard you ask it quite
I've heard him.
Before.
I've heard him say that before. Yair, you say what?
He agrees with me.
I think that it's if you give people a hypothetical where everything works out for them, then they'll say, yeah, I'll take it. But in reality, we live where you don't get those hypotheticals, and it's about the choices you make. And
do you agree with Noam that it would be Hamas cursing?
Hamas would be upset, and most Israelis would be happy. There's a subset of Israelis that we have to acknowledge that actually would be upset as well, because they see basically the idea is, what if you said it was in Gaza? I'm going really into your hypothetical. That our Palestinians remain in Gaza. They're just not with the Hamas people, so you go get Hamas, and then you would presumably get out, right? Because that's done. A certain group of people, I've written about this since the largely beginning of the war, right, who are represented well in Netanyahu's government, who saw October 7th as an opportunity to go into Gaza, take the land, and put in new settlements. And they're very open about this. I'm not like, it's not weird fear-mongering, reading hieroglyphics, or like reading between the lines on a tweet. They did a conference, where they said this is what we're going to do. They've tried to sneak into Gaza, right, to do this already.
But this is a minority of Israelis.
It's a minority of Israelis that exercises, as we've discussed, outsized influence over Netanyahu's decision-making and his coalition, which is messed up, right? And so you end up with this thing where those people, that subset, would be mad because this screws it up for them, because now you kill Hamas and now you got to go. You have no reasons to stay, right? And it's actually, so to them,
what percent?
As always, these sorts of extremists, they feed on each other and they benefit from each other.
We've always had our,
But most Israelis
but Israel used to outlaw these people,
position.
ban them from the Knesset, and Netanyahu used to say, I'd never sit with them.
Yes,
and then as soon as his political career depended on it, he changed his mind completely. And not only did he sit with them, he made them ministers with importance.
Absolutely right, sir. You're right.
So that I feel is a complication that is important to introduce to this. Yeah.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I also feel like that having been said, it is also important to acknowledge that the vast majority of Israelis do not feel that
within
way.
a few months, they all thought, like the general consensus in Israel after October 7th, we're going to go in, we're going to be home, so to speak, by Christmas. It's going to be a few months. We're going to go and root out Hamas. They did not realize how much under Netanyahu, the security agencies, who are also culpable, had failed to surveil and understand Hamas and its positions. Basically, not to be fair to Netanyahu, what actually happened is he made a general evaluation of all the threats facing Israel and said, Iran is the big bad. And the junior bad is Hezbollah, right? Which is their big heavy in the region near us, right? And the itsy bitsy baby bad is the Hamas people, right? And then he took all their smartest and best people and all their smartest and best peepers, and he put them up the chain, right? And then suddenly you weren't really paying attention to Hamas at all, and you had some digital fences and you thought it was going to be fine, right? And so it was a massive screw up. But it's an understandable one from the perspective of what he was doing. And it worked when you saw him fight Hezbollah. You're like, why couldn't they do this before? It's because of exactly this. And so you had all of these people, like Israelis really thought it was going to be a much easier thing. And they thought they would be able to fight this quickly, get Hamas done, and then be out, right? There was this minority that had other designs. And the longer the war has gone on, the more power they have had.
Look, I can't excuse it because it happened. He wasn't wrong that Iran and Hezbollah and who else did you name? Were the more dangerous threats.
No, it was a perfectly reasonable, objective analysis. But he took his eye off of the smaller.
It was a miscalculation.
Right. Yeah. The answer would not to have been to pay less attention to Hezbollah. Because
and I would say then we can go back. Let's do the relitigation, of course, because then there's also the fact that he did the Gilad Shalit trade and he frees 1,000 people, including Yasser Sinwar. And here's the thing: so if Netanyahu, I would credit him so much more if he came out and said, "I'm not going to do that again. I screwed up." Right? I made that deal, and look what happened. The mastermind of October 7th got released. It felt good in the moment. I understand it's a 70-30 issue, but here's the thing: it would be easy for me to do that and go along with it. But in fact, I was wrong, and I'm not going to make that mistake again. He won't say that. He never says he's wrong. He's never even said that he was responsible for anything October 7th. He said everybody but him has been. He's tried to fire everybody but himself. It is astounding. It is astounding.
I just have this, as older and older I get, I'm just reluctant to conclude causation between facts. It really does seem like, yes, if he hadn't released Gilad Shalit, if he had released Sinwar, that October 7th would have happened.
Maybe, or somebody else would have.
Yeah, that's right.
Is it a great man of history theory versus the historical forces?
There's a.
I'm not saying it's the only reason. I'm just saying that in this current political context, there's a very straightforward argument for him to make, which could allow him to justify his current, sort of minoritarian position. But he won't make it because he will not take responsibility for the choices that he did make.
The bigger blunder was taking their eye off the ball. I think getting Gilad Shalit out, it's tough to argue with that. It was not foreseeable that the hang gliders were going to come. I can't hold them accountable for that. We talked about this once a long time ago. It's quite a price to pay into their soul for a nation to say, no, we're leaving them there. It's something would die inside the soul of the nation. And when we have
absolutely, absolutely.
Now you're explaining. Now you're making my argument for why it's a 70-30 issue.
Yeah.
Right. It is genuinely a 70-30 issue, and it continues to be right now to end the war and get the hostages back. And Bibi's not doing it.
But the problem is that a wily guy like Bibi has to cheat it. He has to still allow Israel to feel that it values life. At the same time, he has to deal with the real world, which is that we can't just capitulate, because then every time it's hard.
So there are other responses that one could do to try to mitigate this in the future. You could say we won't do this again. You can also say that it's very unlikely to happen again because we're not going to let it, because these were historic cascade of failures, and we'll say do an inquiry, a public inquiry into how we failed. Except he's blocked the public inquiry.
There's something else, by the way. I don't know if they killed a lot of Palestinians, and there's something that would disturb me about returning to the status quo, only minus those innocent Palestinians. In other words, from the Jewish point of view, we say, listen, we killed all those innocent people, but we achieved this goal. We got rid of Hamas. They might have a better future. We will have a better, there's something to show for it. To kill all these people and say, you know what, we're going to throw in the towel. We could have done. I
don't think Netanyahu, though, is motivated in any way by trying a positive sum future for both. He sees these as a zero-sum game.
I'm saying that
but you can't, because you're relying. But he's the one making the decisions.
I'm saying
it's a totally different.
If Israel were to do that now, it would pain me on behalf of the Palestinian people too. It's like we can't be that casual, killing that many people, and say, you know what, we had enough of this.
Well, I'll tell you, this is probably why I'm
not
deal
with the rockets again.
Probably why I'm not cut out for this sort of thing.
What stops them from making a deal, getting the hostages out, and then going back in and finishing the job with Hamas? I mean, other than
Netanyahu is claiming that it wouldn't work. He's made all sorts of claims about UN resolutions and other stuff, but in point of fact, right, I don't think there is anything that would stop, because just like there's nothing stopping, no piece of paper is going to stop Hamas, whatever remains of it, of saying we're still going to destroy Israel, right? The ceasefire, any ceasefire is a fake ceasefire. It is a temporary ceasefire, no matter what they say, no matter what words describe it. So in the end, Netanyahu is refusing to do it for reasons that aren't unclear unless you look at his political calculus, right? The best case defense of him is to say that he thinks if I put enough pressure, Hamas will give me the best possible deal, which, might happen. I want to acknowledge that possibility. But until we see him actually try to make such a deal, not just a small deal for some hostages, like actually try to do it and actually say we will get out for a time, right? Even though we could always come back, right? Until we see that, I don't believe it, because I haven't seen any evidence of it. But I want to say, you said what would it matter if all these people perished, right? And there has to be something. I just think that there's no good that comes out of that, right? You could say in the end that you look at history and then, the Holocaust, and then you got the state of Israel. It didn't make the Holocaust any better, right? These things are,
but it's already happened.
I'm saying, but all these things, all these things have already happened. The engine of history and tons of people dying, and then we look back, and we who survived look back and say, well, at least this came out of it. No. I understand why we do that as a sort of survival mechanism, but I look at it and I just see,
I just see
tragedy and death.
I don't see how Israel can go back to rockets coming in from Gaza. I think we've learned.
I think that I think that first of all, their capacity has been dramatically degraded.
No, but it can be built right back up.
No, that's the sort of thing that you can stop, right? If you actually decided, you can say we want this border policed in a real way, and that can actually happen. They chose to stop sending in huge amounts of Qatari money, right? You don't have to do that.
They'll smuggle in the money.
Right?
Don't be naive. Who's naive now, Kay?
I don't think so.
The oil for food program. They're always going to get money. They're always going to get rockets. There is no. If you're going to have a genocidal, even Dave Smith death cult in charge of Gaza, they're going to rear their ugly head again. It has to be stopped. It has to be. I that's my opinion. We want the same thing. It's not but I don't see, and go on indefinitely. It's terrible for the Palestinians. Now, I don't know if it's feasible. This is where expertise matters. We have there, these are things I don't know enough. I don't know what the conversation.
We say it's terrible for the Palestinians. I'm not sure that they would be in accord if you gave them the choice.
Listen, there are historic there are historic protests right now of the Palestinian people against Hamas that have.
Well, but how many? What percentage of the population does that truly represent?
I don't know, but it's noteworthy.
Okay, Trump's Jewish cover story. Just quick, we're out of time, aren't we? Okay.
Well,
you wrote an article. Do you remember it? Did you write so much?
Vaguely. It's like 2 articles ago.
The administration claims to be protecting Jews while advancing an agenda that most Jews oppose. This is about, what is it about, deporting the students and stuff like that?
Attacking higher education, deporting the students, right? These things that have been done under the banner of fighting anti-Semitism, despite being the sorts of means that Jews did not ask for and carried out by politicians that Jews overwhelmingly did not vote for. And so that is the general, very capsule summary of it.
Now, I have to tell you, I've heard a lot of... I'm very much due process and uncomfortable about these deportations for things that are expressed. But I'm hearing a lot of Jews that surprise me that are very squishy about this. They're like, they're so outraged by what's going on in the campuses.
Yeah, well, it's a 70-30 issue, right? That's still a 30. Right? So there's plenty of people who will be supportive, right? But as I pointed to the piece, right? Jews overwhelmingly 3 straight elections.
Well, Jews didn't vote for it because it wasn't on the ballot.
No. It was one of the very few planks of the Republican platform that he was going to deport pro-Hamas radicals and make our campuses patriotic again.
Knew that.
I said it in speech after speech after speech.
I didn't even know it. I went to a Trump rally. I didn't even know it.
I was just saying it was part of the stump speech. He said it many, many times.
Do you remember hearing that?
This is not an example. He did not hide the ball. Right.
I have a question.
You have too much. It
is always the case that as someone who covers these things professionally, I know more than other people.
Really, nobody knew that.
But
wait a second, though. But we're talking.
I do think it relates to some of the people, the folks in Dearborn, Michigan, who voted for this, not realizing that he was very explicitly promising to do these sorts of things.
But how would they not have known that if you're saying that he mentioned it so many times?
Of course, there are plenty of people who don't know things.
Okay,
right. But that being said, Jewish voters in general tend to be much more higher information election voters. They vote in more elections. They know more about these things. We have surveys that show that. So on average, they are going to know more.
Even if they're aware of it, I don't know if people voted on it.
They were certainly aware that Trump's, was a more pro-Israel candidate.
Do you not think...
But can I ask you a question? I don't want to limit this to Muslims because that would sound... I was worried about this issue before it was... The Islam issue. I became worried about this just in hearing the way my employees were talking. Just that, and even James Surowiecki, is that how you pronounce it? I can never pronounce his name. You know who I'm talking about.
I read it just like you, I hope that I know what
he tweeted out. He's like, he saw there was some Mexican immigrant protests, and they were carrying Mexican flags. He says, "Why aren't you carrying American flags?" And he's there is just something fundamentally different in the attitude that the current generations of immigrants have from our parents' generation of immigrants. And it's not bigotry to notice it, and it's not unwise to spin it out. Well, where does this lead? Just because we worked out in the past doesn't mean it has to work out in the future. It would seem to me we'd all feel better about it if everybody was coming to America saying, "God bless America. Thank you, America, for taking me in." Of course, some things are not practical about that anymore. We have cell phones. We have people are texting for free to the motherland. My father came here. That's it. There wasn't even a long distance phone call in those days. So you really had to plant roots in America. I mean, you don't have to plant roots anywhere in the modern world.
Anecdotally, the second generation.
That's not good for our country.
The second generation of the immigrants you're speaking of.
We don't know.
I'm not seeing, but to the extent that we're seeing it, take Mustafa, who used to work here. He had children with an American non-Muslim.
No, he's first generation. He's pro-American.
Right. So,
he's an immigrant and he loves it. No. There's I'm sure the overwhelming majority of immigrants.
Let me just say something about. But this is a thing that you described seeing something on social media where, and I see these videos too, where people are protesting Trump's policies and they're waving a Mexican flag, right? Or you're burning an American flag in more extreme cases. And what is this message that you're sending? Of course, it's terrible politics, and it's the sort of thing that makes people actually push to the other end. I would submit that this stuff always happened. We just have cell phones and social media.
Maybe.
And I think there's an element of this that social media excels at feeding us the things about the other Americans we normally wouldn't have encountered, that the only people who ever encountered them were businessmen and politicians when they had to traverse the entire country. And now we see like an entire like influencers and commentators and Tucker Carlson's and also, it's not political. It have created a business model.
He is mentally ill. Right?
I have no idea. Again, you asked me about the internal states of people,
He
and I
said
have no
he's
answers.
mauled by demons. You're a religious person.
So interesting. I'm reading Ross Douthat's book on religion.
Unconvincing.
And, so I don't agree with all, but the thing that it's made me more considerate about is like the concept of demonic forces and thinking about it. And it's obviously not such a mainstream position in Judaism, but it exists. And I'm like, you know what? When I watch, certain the type of anti-Semitism that I have to expose myself to regularly, mass marketed anti-Semitism to do my job, there's something demonic about that. There would be. I can understand how someone could come to look at that and believe that there are actually demonic forces acting in the world. Right?
Wait,
No, but I get how people get there.
She wanted to ask a question. We got to go.
I have so
Are the demons in the room with us right now?
So what the first question is, about what's going on the university campuses with this rabid anti-Semitism, which is not just free. Don't do that.
Speak a little quickly, or
which is not just this like freedom of speech and expression, but also seems to be inciting violence against Jews and harassing Jews and locking people in buildings. And something needs to be done about that, right? Like that can't just...
I wrote about this in my article. There's a tremendous number of things that could be done. These schools set up anti-Semitism task force, some of which produced really good reports, which had very straightforward recommendations for how the schools could consistently enforce their policies on everybody, or Israel, anti-Israel, on any issue, and just saying, here's the policies on the book.
But they're not doing that.
So, but the thing is, they were moving towards that, and some of the schools were. They had the task force. It's a process. This is the process thing, right? But they were
tell
doing
that to the
it.
kids
And then
that
Trump
are
comes in
locked
with, the Elon Musk, a chainsaw, and says, we're going to do it this way. And he's not really going after the issue in any way. He's like, we're going to fund Jewish cancer researchers at Columbia and solve anti-Semitism.
I'm not saying that
He's
that's
right,
a
Periel.
good thing. I'm not agreeing with that. I'm saying that these task forces didn't seem to be doing what they were supposed to be doing.
And they won't.
So, no, I think a task force alone can't. Then it becomes an administration. Will they make these decisions? But they were doing those things. I mean, Harvard's president, Alan Garber, was actually doing stuff.
Listen,
and
you're
was
never
going
going to get an organization to do what is not in its heart to do. That's utterly naive. These people don't believe in it, and they will therefore never do it.
That's my point.
Snap out of it. It is not possible. That's it. It's just not. It's not going to happen. It's never going to happen. I can't get my I can't get my employees to do something.
So then here's my question. So if you take that as a given, then if you try to compel them to do it, knowing that they won't, right? Even if they were to do it, they would not believe it. And when you're out of power and 10 minutes later, it will go away. What have you accomplished other than actually destroying a lot and turning people against the people you claim to be protecting because they will blame them for the destruction?
I am not defending Trump's policy.
Yeah, neither am I, to be very clear.
So, like, you could take the most pessimistic view of all of these administrations and every single task force, and I would then do my nuanced thing and say, well, this university I thought was doing a job. This one I thought was not. Right? This task force is serious. This one I thought was not.
This is what I'm saying. This is what I'm saying. Any conversation, now you may not agree with me, any conversation has to be based on blocks that are real. In my opinion, the notion that we're going to implement some sort of change through a task force that the same people who left to their druthers gave us A are now going to give us B because we told them to is exactly why Ezra Klein wrote that book. This is nonsense. It's never going to happen. So either we're going to live with it or, get really, really friggin' tough and reform the whole thing and bite the bullet and change.
So I don't think the external, like what's being done is in any way responsive to it or going to work. But I do think is that there were other responses. You could look at this and say, and people were doing this, right, that certain parts of higher education are failing, right? So then you can do all sorts of things. You can say, I'm going to set up competing institutions, which people were starting to do.
Yes.
Right? It becomes easier as the number of college students are falling and suddenly institutions need to be rescued. You could rescue one of them and say, and now we're going to try it my way. So you don't even have to build it all new. It already has accreditation, things like that. You also can do what have been done by both Democratic and Republican governors, which is getting rid of college degree requirements for a tremendous number of jobs that shouldn't need it. This ridiculous gatekeeping. If you can reduce the salience of some of this stuff simply by doing things like that.
Okay, but there, as much as I agree with you, I am recalling now that Keanu
Reeves?
No.
Kalani.
Keanu James.
Yes.
Kamani James.
Yeah.
who was interviewed by the Columbia faculty, and he told them, "I want to kill the Zionists."
Yes.
He said, "Okay, we'll go back to class." And the only reason we found out because he released the video.
Yes. Said, I want to kill Zionists, so people know that's what said.
It was like any killer's manifesto.
Yes.
Right?
If you had someone to do that about another group, you would look at this and say, you got to get this guy out of the classrooms, even if it's just a possibility. You don't do that on a college campus today.
Now, in our current climate, if black people were on the receiving end of the overt bigotry that we've been seeing towards Jews and the winking at it by faculty members, I think there'd be a lot of support for Trump's policy. That wouldn't make it right either, but I think it's worth saying that part of the reason people are outraged about it because they don't care about this the same way they'd care about it if it was a different bigotry. I think that's true. Again, that wouldn't make the policy right in the other case, but I think you'd have a lot of people ready to raise hell.
I think it would be different people,
turn
but
the
I
place
think
upside down if it was.
We
black
have a
people.
lot of sensitivity towards bigotry towards ourselves and our group, and we see all the
Nobody
time
cares.
that people don't care and they don't pick it up. But if you then have a conversation with,
if we saw black people
many
cowering,
black friends, fine, and they will say this is the experience they often have when they are trying to raise these
If
sorts
we
of
saw
things,
black people-
except in very specific liberal contexts.
If we
right?
saw black
only
people,
those contexts.
if we saw black people cowering in Ivy League universities.
No, because it was happening in a liberal institution that has particular sensitivity to this thing, so you just restricted it. Now, let's open it to the entire country into many, many other realms of things. Then suddenly many places it wouldn't be cared about. If we saw people who have the particular tattoos and skin colors who were being treated, whether they were citizens or not, in all sorts of crazy ways.
What I'm saying is if we who
people would
oppose
just look
Trump,
the other way.
if we, the Democratic Party, saw black people cowering at a university getting hundreds of millions of dollars of federal money, we'd say, not a fucking another dollar of federal money until you clean that up once and for all.
I have a question.
That would be the reaction. So, I mean,
I have a question that
I don't know. I'm not informed enough on the nuts and bolts of it.
Now, you're for those of us who are for those people not watching on YouTube, you're wearing a kippah.
Yes.
That's a traditional Jewish garment. That
As my best fans call, as my greatest anti-Semitic fans call, a small hat.
that marks you as, I guess, Orthodox.
So religiously observant. I come from a modern Orthodox community.
So, how confident are you, if at all, that God exists?
How confident am I? And depends on.
I mean, you're a very intelligent guy.
This is a great. This is what I was expecting to have some more conversations about. This is way more interesting, and also there's no good answers. I have more confidence in the existence of God than I do in the correctness of any individual Jewish tradition or interpretation of God. I think that the existence of consciousness, when you open your eyes and something is here, the explicability of the universe, right? That it follows certain rules, that our brains somehow evolved in a way that we can actually understand those, right? There's a lot of those sorts of things lead me to the idea that there is a design to these things, right? But then a lot of people have a lot of different understandings of what there are implications of that. And that becomes a much, much more complicated conversation. And this is the tradition I inherited. It speaks to me not just in a communal sort of horizontal way, but in a vertical way, connecting me through centuries, right? But on any given day, do I theologically believe all of this stuff? Of course not. But, that's the modern condition and religion, I think. And as I said, I'm a modern Orthodox Jew, as opposed to if I grew up in a different place, it probably would be different. But that is sort of, it's an extraordinarily meaningful.
But God didn't want that for you,
right? It's a great question, right? This is, so you asked me about God and Judaism, right? God and particular versions of Judaism, right? These are all very different questions.
Right.
So after you die,
I have a lot of things to take up with God.
What do you think happens?
After I die, what do I think happens?
What do you think happens to
you?
I
hope I will be surprised in a positive way. I think that's they asked Marilyn. I'm just stealing that. That's Marilyn Robinson, the amazing.
But you believe
Christian novelist.
You believe you'll have a consciousness after death.
I hope.
You hope.
I don't know.
Well, you hope or you believe.
I hope. I don't know.
Believe doesn't mean you're sure, but you.
I mean, belief is also. I feel like in some senses,
I believe my wife is faithful.
You hope.
No, I believe.
But if you're so unsure, what's with the hat?
If I'm so unsure, what's with the hat?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, the hat has more significance than just about specific philosophical questions. It's about identification with the community, right, and a commitment to a particular story and to being part of it, and especially a story that people have tried to end. Right, and where people want to push people out of.
Yeah.
And it's also part of a meaningful membership of a community that that matters a lot to me. See, why don't you just start with this? This is so much.
I didn't have the nerve, and you have tons of Trump supporters in your community.
I'm in the modern Orthodox community is more diverse than the say like the broader Orthodox community. It's absolutely the case that the Orthodox community in general is more Trumpy, right, than the rest of the Jewish community
because they can't recognize an anti-Semite.
I think which makes me a better journalist because I constantly am talking to people who are seeing the world in a different way, and that has given me a certain advantage and insight into stuff, right? And like I think that's valuable, right? And like if I didn't have it, I'd be worse at my job.
Of course, we were talking about the argument that came up between Murray and Smith about whether you need to travel someplace to report on it and what the benefits of it. And you're just similar to what you're saying. You don't have to, but it can
be done the other way, and sometimes and I would say there are also advantages to distance, right? If you do it right, like I report on Israeli politics while periodically visiting, but otherwise not being there, and that gives me benefits because I don't get sucked into the groupthink of every the sort of groupthink we have on our intellectual side. Yeah. They've got it there too, right? But I have this distance, which enables me to sort of put things together in a way that perhaps sometimes wouldn't be put together over there. I learned that lesson the hard way because I was like there for the 2015 election, and I fell for all the groupthink, and then it didn't work out the way that the groupthink said, and I was like, oh, okay, so that's how this works. Yeah. Right? Like we all have that moment.
All right. We're way over time, and we also did another 2-hour podcast earlier, or at least. I'm very happy to meet you.
Likewise.
And
by the way, 1 hour with Yair is about 10 hours.
Yeah, audio.
10
Just think about the audio
with Finkelstein.
I was like,
no, because you speak so quickly.
At the speed that I'm saying, it's like 1 hour with me, but you got like twice the amount of content. Yes. But the problem is I didn't announce at the beginning that if you're the sort of person who listens to podcasts on double speed, you definitely need to slow it down. So they just think something is wrong with their device.
Finkelstein speaks. He's the opposite of you. He speaks.
Yes.
Destiny speaks twice as fast as you.
I don't know. I debated Ben Shapiro about a whole bunch of Jewish issues and anti-Semitism and sort of stuff, and it's a time capsule because before October 7th. It's really interesting. I think it's still a really interesting thing to go back. We did it for 2 hours. I think we broke the land speed record for most words spoken per minute. So that in and of itself is fun to watch.
Do you speak with him off grid?
Do I speak like periodically with many different people because I'm reporting on this stuff? So if I have a question, I try to message everybody. I've tried to,
But where is he on Trump? Do you know?
Where's he on? I mean, he's this. I can't. I have no special insight into Ben Shapiro and all this stuff. But like what I'm saying is, as I report on the conservative movement, and so I will talk to everyone who will talk to me. I wish more of them would talk to me. Right, quite frankly, if you're watching this podcast, right, my DMs are open because the only way, as I said, to understand what's really going on, right, in any of these places, you have to talk to people and hear what they think is happening.
Who are the conservative? Oh, we could go on and on. I'm so disenchanted with every. I can't even name a politician I support. They're all awful.
I mean, I think people should not put their faith in politicians. Politicians are there to do a job, and that's as much of it. We've invested a lot in our politicians that I don't think they could ever hold.
None of them even pretend to stand for things that I.
What about that guy from Pennsylvania?
Shapiro.
No.
Fetterman?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm happy he's pro-Israel. I don't know how he is on other things.
He's pretty good, I think.
Maybe you need to get hit over the head.
So as a reporter, I maintain a very healthy dose of skepticism with a certain amount of, appreciation for the humanity of people who are in politics, both of those things at the same time. I worry that a lot of people, especially early first-time voters, very often give totemic significance to politicians that they don't deserve and that they could never deliver upon. Yeah. That's why you see radical swings among young people in general on some of their politics, but other people do it too. And it's as certain other institutional religion and other things have fallen away, we've invested those energies in other things, including politics. And I don't think that's a pretty healthy dynamic. It's just to say politicians are there to work for you, to do a job, right? And that's it.
Now, if you think of like a basic Mitt Romney, circa whatever it was, 2012.
Yeah.
That guy would be a pretty solid guy for me right now. Like kind of moderate, but savvy on foreign affairs, economically smart. I would like that. There is no Mitt Romney.
There's no Mitt Romney in the Senate anymore. You noticed? He left.
Yeah, and that's right. And even Hillary Clinton, I mean, wasn't that long ago I was saying actually the people who voted for Hillary Clinton and the people who voted for Mitt Romney don't even remember what they disagreed about. Like it's not even like because both parts of those parties were actually so close. I think it should be a $13 minimum wage. I think it should be $14.50 minimum wage. These were the kind of arguments, right?
Yeah, so the critics would say that those were masking some fundamental failures in the society, and those eventually come out, right? But you could also say that if the system works as it should, some of those should get addressed, in part through populism, and then you get back to a new consensus. The question is, has social media and various other phenomena sort of changed the game in a way where we can break things much worse rather than fix them? And I don't have an answer to that. That's one of the questions that I'm looking at, right, as a reporter.
By the way, I chose Hillary. He didn't run against Romney, but because Hillary was closer. Obama, I think people remember why they would vote for Romney over Obama. But Hillary, I don't think it mattered. All right. Well, thank you very much. Can we have you on again when something terrible happens in the world?
That's only the time that anyone ever wants me on. So if you want to have me on for to talk to Yankees and movies and things like that, I'd appreciate it.
You're from New York originally?
From New York originally, inherited Yankee fandom.
Are you a Godfather person?
Am I a Godfather person?
A bit young, perhaps.
I enjoyed, but it came up recently on social media. You see this? Because Norman Finkelstein?
No.
I
did see. He said there was no Jewish.
There are no Jewish gangsters in any of television and film, and even I, who is not a particular fan of this genre, I knew that this was a lie. Right?
Hyman Roth.
So the basic thing that he reeled is that he doesn't watch movies, but he talks about them, which
Yeah. Bugsy was about Bugsy Siegel, and Once Upon a Time in America was about Jewish gangsters.
There's so many. There's so many.
I'll tell you a funny story before we go. I accompanied my friend Stephen Calabria on an interview of F. Lee Bailey, the attorney who defended O.J., shortly before he died. And he was telling us this story about how he had written a script. He said O.J. was innocent, and I don't remember. I have a recording of it. I don't remember all the details. And it was an amazing story, and it implicated Ron Goldman was sleeping with Nicole. And I said, this is a great story. Why didn't they make a movie of it? He looks at me like I'm an idiot. He goes, Goldman was a Jew. It's like this, the great F. Lee Bailey, which has shot off as the most anti-Semitic Jewish control. Hollywood's not going to make a movie where Goldman looks bad. Goldman's a Jew. I thought it was a better story than it was. But it was just this is how people think.
And we could go on and on about ethnic stereotypes and why they adhere to different groups and stuff like that. I mean, it does make me think when you bring it back to your conspiracy theory point. What annoys me about conspiracy theories is that they're usually a bad answer to a good question.
Yeah.
And they short circuit things. It's why is this group more represented or less represented in this area?
Let's end with that. Why are the Jews more represented in everything academic and intelligence?
Well, my tongue-in-cheek, this is not true. My tongue-in-cheek answer is Jews in academia is that academia is just secularized kollel. If you know what kollel is when people would study Talmud in perpetuity funded by Jewish philanthropists. It's like what happens with the Haredim in Israel, except they're funded by the government, which is a little different. But it was private philanthropy would fund young Jews who were engaged in esoteric texts of questionable practical value, right? So once you secularize that in the United States, you get graduate programs, right? So this is not really true. This is not actually what happened. I have actually asked real historians, and they're this is wrong. But I think there are some impulses to that, which is the idea that Jews like to support education, right? Why Jews valued literacy historically.
Why is that?
Because they had all these texts that were so central to their tradition, which then leads to people need to having to do that. Because Moses,
that's why it's
got the text at Sinai, right? If you believe that sort of thing. But it's if you have a very text-based religion that's very focused on that rather than entirely on oral tradition.
It could be that the people that were into that stuck around, so the smarter people stuck around, and the dumber people said, I don't need this texty religion.
Well, there's a general probably a very straightforward explanation for sort of Jewish nerdiness or intellectualism is that back in the day, if you were in the shtetl and your kid was a particularly great Talmud student, it was tradition you would marry that person off to the daughter of the wealthy merchant, and he would support you in your studies. And so that in the end creates a family that's more likely to have more intellectual kids, right? And you're just you're privileging those people, and if you privilege that sort of thing, you will get more of it. And so we had that for quite a while, and that probably served a lot of this sort of stuff, made sure that it was part of the culture, and also so it's nature and nurture basically.
Dan, please.
I'm sorry. Thought it was funny.
I thought we could not edit the episode. Now you got to cut something out. Let's say goodnight. All right.
There's always something you say that can be misinterpreted. There's no real,
Okay. Good night, everybody. Podcast at comedycellar.com.